So, when we left off last time, we had been setting the stage for the discussions of the causes of homosexuality, as well as building our theoretical understanding of why this sexual orientation carries such a large fitness cost and why that's important. And this is because a strict lifetime homosexual orientation and homosexual behaviors, strict lifetime behaviors where you only have that type of intercourse, does not produce offspring. And because of that, psychological mechanisms that generate such preferences and behaviors, both in terms of biasing someone towards engaging in those behaviors and making people avoid heterosexual intercourse, these psychological mechanisms should be expected to be selected against by evolutionary processes rather heavily. Because the name of the game in evolution is reproduction. So psychological mechanisms that produce outputs that discourage the only behaviors capable of achieving reproduction naturally pose an evolutionary mystery in the same way that heterosexuality does not. Heterosexuality needs an explanation, and that explanation is the only route through which many species manage to reproduce. Homosexuality, strict lifelong homosexuality, is the opposite. So to catch everyone up on the foundational information we had discussed from last time, we saw that homosexual orientation tends to be present in about 1 to 5% of the population, depending on how you ask the question and how you sample. So let's just say about 3%. About 3% of the adult population would consider themselves homosexual. And we were also distinguishing theoretically, between homosexual behavior, that is same-sex contact, homosexual attractions, and heterosexual aversions. Because these are separate things. And each of them pose different levels of evolutionary mysteries. Finally, we also noted that while same-sex contact is occasionally documented in a variety of non-human species, it's hard to infer from that same-sex contact that what we're seeing are psychological sexual orientations. That is, it's only when we can document persistent same-sex contact over a lifetime and aversions to opposite-sex sexual contact that we can be more clear that we have evidence of homosexual orientations. And in that respect, there are only 2 species I'm aware of that have a well-documented body of literature demonstrating homosexual orientations. And that's humans and domestic sheep. I believe the estimates I heard, about 8 to 10% of rams show very distinct evidence of homosexual orientations. So before we begin today, I'd like to stress again, because this is important, that this topic does carry a great deal of social contention, and I need to repeat that we should not conflate examinations of the theoretical underpinnings and causations of homosexual orientations with stances as to moral acceptability. Some people wish homosexual behavior to be broadly accepted, others wish it to be discouraged, and depending on which stance you hold, both of them are really capable of influencing and biasing how theories are understood, how data is interpreted, and even what questions people feel like you're allowed to ask in the first place. However, I want to make it clear that things are not morally good because they have been selected for, are found in the natural world, are common, or adaptive, that is, encourage reproduction. These things do not make something morally good. Because if that was the case, we might view psychological mechanisms that encourage things like greed and murder as good, or praise the parasitic species of wasp that lays its eggs inside still living hosts, so that when the larvae hatch, they eat their host from the inside out. Not exactly the most moral way to reproduce yourself. Yet it's found in nature. Similarly, just because something is unnatural or carries reproductive costs, that doesn't mean those things are bad or worthy of scorn. Many people, for instance, wear contact lenses or eyeglasses to correct vision problems. And that doesn't mean that these are morally bad things to do because they're unnatural. And because seeing is adaptive, people who can't see well are somehow bad. We want to avoid making any leaps like that. All we're trying to do today is understand the topic. That is, what forces maintain homosexuality in the population, despite what should be extreme selective pressures against psychologies that hinder their own reproduction. And I'll also stress again my personal stance on the topic, which is that I am happy to support the ability of consenting adults to engage in whatever sexual behavior they wish to engage in, whether alone or with other people, regardless of why they want to do it. As long as everyone's a consenting party, by all means. The explanation of what causes a thing to happen is different than the question of whether that thing is acceptable, and my stance on acceptability tends to favor social acceptance of homosexuality, whatever the causes of homosexuality end up being. For similar reasons, I would oppose things that we used to have on the books, at least here in the US, like sodomy laws, which outlawed oral and anal intercourse. So bear in mind, all we're trying to do today is explain and understand. We want to see what theories have been proposed, how and why these homosexual preferences come to exist, how they are maintained, and whether these theories make conceptual sense and whether they're supported by the data. So with that necessary caution stated, let's continue on with our examination of the theories that have attempted to explain homosexuality and what data bears on them. Some of these theories propose the adaptive function of homosexuality, that is, homosexuality and preferences for homosexual behavior itself provides benefits, reproductive benefits in some capacity. They propose an adaptive explanation. Some people propose a byproduct explanation, that is, homosexual orientations themselves do not increase reproductive fitness, but are a byproduct of other mechanisms that do. And other theories still posit the existence of external causes. That is, homosexuality is not an adaptation, and it's not a byproduct of an adaptation exactly, but is rather caused by something else. And there's a lot of ground I want to cover today, so by necessity, I'm not going to be able to delve into every theory as deeply as I would like, because we just have so many to discuss. What we're going to try and do instead is give you a general overview of what theories have been proposed, and whether they can, in principle and in practice, actually explain this phenomenon that they are trying to. The first of these I wanted to discuss comes from a researcher by the name of Daryl Bem, proposed this in 1996. This is not Daryl Bem, this is Joe Exotic, and you'll see why I bring this up in a second. Specifically, what Daryl Bem proposed is this idea he called exotic becomes erotic. Now, Bem attempted to explain the development of both heterosexual and homosexual orientations with the following developmental story. When children are young, they come into this world just with general temperaments, no sexual orientations. These children then perceive those who like similar things to them as being similar to them, and they perceive others who enjoy different things as being dissimilar or exotic. These exotic or different things, they then generate some non-specific autonomic arousal. Autonomic arousal just means your heart is speeding up, you're breathing faster. And this could be the result of things like fear or disgust or anger or excitement or curiosity. Just a general physical arousal that something is different and this is attention grabbing for you. So this is going to include your physiological responses, your elevated heart rate, increased rates of breathing, etc. This general physiological arousal that children feel to different things, different others, is then later in life translated into erotic feelings, specifically sexual arousal by different others. So in the case of heterosexuality, boys come into this world with some temperaments. They feel different than girls. Because boys feel different than girls, they perceive girls to be physiologically arousing, ooh, this is different. My heart's speeding up. I'm breathing faster. I'm curious. I'm excited. I'm fearful, whatever the case may be. And this arousal is then later translated into sexual arousal. And this ends up with heterosexuality. However, let's say if a girl feels different from other girls, she will then become physiologically aroused by other girls and later sexually aroused by other girls. In other words, develop a homosexual orientation. And indeed, to Bem, he doesn't think there's anything particularly strange about homosexuality. He doesn't seem to understand at any point throughout his paper why heterosexuality is viewed as this typical pattern of attraction. And he indeed contrasts his theory of arousal with a genetic theory. He thinks they're very different. Bem thinks his views and explanations are opposed to genetic explanations. Now, as all traits have genetic bases to some degree, this already doesn't bode well for this exotic becomes erotic theory. All traits have genetic basis to some degree, and genetic influences are not the opposite of environmental causes. We covered this way earlier in our classes. But everything is a mixture of environmental and genetic influences and interactions. And because Bem is conflating, or rather contrasting, Bem is contrasting his theory with a genetic theory, this is suggesting that Bem really doesn't understand how to ask questions and think about biological function in the evolutionary sense. But what evidence does he use to support his theory? Well, on an empirical level, there is some evidence that is at least consistent with his idea. Namely that one of the better predictors of a later homosexual orientation in life is childhood gender nonconformity. That is, does this boy tend to act like other boys, or does this boy tend to not act like other boys, or vice versa for girls? And Bem presents some data here that you can see from researchers Bell and colleagues that they published in 1981, which found that 63% of homosexual men in adulthood, but only 10% of heterosexual men, reported not enjoying sex-typical activities. And for women, those numbers, as you can see, are 63% for homosexual women, 15% for heterosexual women. This means that straight men tended to like sex-typical activities, and homosexual men tended to avoid those sex-typical activities in greater numbers. Similarly, 48% of homosexual men reported enjoying sex-atypical activities, and only 10% of heterosexual men did. Again, you can see those numbers for women. When it came to homosexual women, those were 81% and 61% respectively. When it came to whether they were atypical in their overall degree of masculinity and femininity, again, about 56% of homosexual men were atypical, whereas only 8% of heterosexual men were atypical. And those numbers for women, again, as you can see on the right-hand side, were 80% for homosexual women, 24% for heterosexual. And finally, if you were examining whether most of your friends, when you were young, were opposite sex in childhood, that is, did men have more female friends and did women have more male friends, homosexual men reported that 42% of the time, most of their friends were from the opposite sex. And it was only 13% for heterosexual men. Again, for women, you see those numbers, 60% and 40%. So you see a lot more gender nonconformity when children are young in people that later develop homosexual orientations, whereas those who later develop heterosexual orientations tended to be more gender typical. And additionally, data from that research also found that 70% of homosexual respondents that got surveyed reported feeling different from their same-sex peers when they were younger, while only about 40 to 50% of heterosexual respondents did. So people who later developed homosexual orientations tended to feel different than their same-sex peers when they were young. And as a further paper in 2016 by Bailey and colleagues notes as well, when you have children who spontaneously and persistently engage in gender atypical behavior when you're young, these are things like boys playing with dolls and wearing dresses while they avoid rough and tumble play, you tend to find that those people are more likely to later develop a non-heterosexual orientation. And as these behaviors typically emerge by preschool age, it seems that whatever causes these gender non-conforming behaviors tends to be happening early in life, within the first 3 to 5 years at least. And the more extreme this gender nonconformity is in its degree, the more likely a later homosexual orientation will emerge. Now, there's one quick thing to note about this finding, which is that what we're talking about here is a correlation. That is, childhood gender nonconformity can, to some degree, help us predict what later orientations will develop. There's a predictive accuracy. However, because this is a correlation, this predictive accuracy is neither perfect, you can't perfectly predict who's going to end up where, nor does it necessarily mean A is causing B. That is to say, it may not be, and indeed probably is not, the act of playing with dolls and wearing dresses in boys that causes them to later develop a homosexual orientation, in much the same way that a girl who's engaged in rough and tumble play, that's probably not going to cause her to develop a later homosexual orientation. Instead, what's probably happening is something early in development is causing both the gender nonconformity at an early age and a sexual orientation in later years. So as such, it's unlikely that doing something as simple as like taking dolls away from boys or preventing girls from engaging in rough and tumble play would in any way meaningfully change their later sexual orientation. Indeed, a lot of the gender nonconformity you see when kids are young, not only does it often emerge spontaneously, but it will persist in those children, even though parents may make external efforts to try and prevent it from happening. Even if parents are saying to their boy that's wearing dresses, I don't want you wearing dresses, you're going to stop doing this, you're going to dress like a boy. Even though parents are trying to do this, they're usually very unsuccessful at getting the kid to stop doing what the kid wants to do. However, that evidence that we just reviewed is about all the evidence consistent with this idea of exotic becomes erotic. There's only that one correlation between childhood gender nonconformity and your later orientation. And on a theoretical level, there's a major series of problems with this model. The first, like many non-evolutionary theories, this one makes very little sense if you tried to apply it to pretty much any other species on the planet. That is, imagine thinking about a non-human species. Do pigs or birds or insects require this sense in their childhood that the opposite sex is different from them before they can start developing heterosexual mating preferences? It doesn't seem that's the case at all. It's clear that other species are navigating the development of their sexual orientations just fine without needing to invoke this idea that exotic should become erotic. Now, why humans would do that this way and other species wouldn't is a question that Bem never really addresses because he's not thinking about it. But that's really a rather important question to talk about, because if this mechanism is being used by humans but not other species, that would imply at some point this mechanism for shaping sexual orientation was selected for specifically in the human line. And what reproductive advantages that method of development might hold when it seems to ensure that at least a sizable minority of the population develops these non-reproductive orientations, that's never really addressed by the theory itself. A second major problem with this theory is that Bem never explains why this physiological arousal would get translated into later erotic arousal. He assumes that it does, but he never explains why it might. And this is important because many things are both different from young boys and girls, and they're highly physiologically arousing. For instance, many animals cause real intense physiological arousal in children. They're excited by animals. They're afraid of animals. And these animals are clearly very different than humans. But despite these animals being exotic, being different, and being physiologically arousing, humans do not typically become sexually attracted to animals as this model might predict. Similarly, toys are very physiologically arousing to children. Children love toys. When I was young, I liked nothing more than grabbing sticks and pretending they were swords and guns and swinging them around and having a great time. I was very physiologically aroused. Toys, animals, and these other objects are both physiologically arousing to children and different than children. Yet children don't seem to produce erotic feelings to toys later in life. So despite me finding swords fun and swords different from humans, I never became sexually aroused by swords. So, as to why people aren't developing these sexual attractions to things which are different and physiologically arousing, this model is at a complete loss. Bem says something along the lines of exotic but not too exotic, as if that helps save his theory, without ever expanding on what that means or how can you tell. And finally, on an empirical level, there's both no evidence that directly supports any causal pathway, and quite a bit of contradictory data. Indeed, if we go back and we look at this other data we just looked at, that Bem himself presents in support of his theory, about 37% of adult homosexual men reported enjoying gender-typical activities. 52% of gay men and 19% of lesbian women reported avoiding gender-atypical activities. And about half of both homosexual men and women, most of their childhood friends were of the same sex as they were. In other words, many people who develop a homosexual orientation later in life were apparently not viewing their same sex as being particularly different. They were spending time with same-sex friends, and they were engaged in gender-typical activities. And you can also see on the reverse side, there were many heterosexual men that also had friends of the opposite sex predominantly, avoided gender-typical activities, and engaged in gender-typical activities. Or rather, engaged in gender-atypical activities, but they developed a heterosexual orientation all the same. So if you're trying to explain this large discrepancy, this theory would also be at a loss. So this idea of exotic becomes erotic seems to be both at a theoretical loss and an empirical loss. It makes little evolutionary sense and isn't even particularly well supported by what little data it attempts to claim in its favor. So we can probably disregard that. But I would like to take this moment to think about how you might have felt when you heard about this theory of exotic becomes erotic. Hopefully this theory didn't upset too many people on a moral level, even though it is very much a theory about the causes of the development of your sexual orientation. And it posits that those causes are out there in the social environment, that they're caused by environmental variables. And in fact, if you're a careful listener and thoughtful about what we just discussed, you might think that, well, if this exotic becomes erotic theory is actually true, that seems to imply that you could change the rates of homosexuality. You could increase it or you could decrease it by changing the exotic nature of opposite or same-sex peers in childhood through interventions. That is, the more you could make a child feel like the opposite sex is different from them, the more you could encourage heterosexuality later in life. Or the more you could say your same sex is different than you, the more you could encourage homosexuality in later life. And that might put people on a little bit of a moral edge. They don't like that. That is, some people might find that hypothesis offensive or insensitive in some way for just that reason, because it seems to imply that children aren't just born with their sexual orientations, that it's something you can actually affect through interventions. And as the famous Lady Gaga song Born This Way might imply, you could certainly get a sense that that's a prevailing view a lot of people hold. That people are just genetically determined to have homosexual or heterosexual orientations, and environmental influences really don't have much to say about it. That is, when it comes to homosexuality, for instance, many people will ask the question, are they born this way? That is it determined by your genes, or is it a choice? Now, this is not a view that we should really take for several reasons. First, as we discussed before, all traits need to develop to exist. You have to go from a single fertilized egg to several trillion cells. Every trait has to develop, and this development is never influenced by just genes or just environmental factors. Nor are genes and environmental factors in any way opposed to one another. They're not different things, such that the more genes matter, the less environment matters, and vice versa. There's always an interaction between genetic and environmental factors that co-determine the development of all traits. So really the question we want to ask is, which genetic and environmental factors matter, when do they matter, and why do they matter? These are all questions worth examining. But placing genetic and environmental, or genetic and choice, as somehow in opposition to each other is a route you don't want to take. It's nonsense. So this is really a poor question to ask, because if you're asking, is it genetic or is it a choice? The opposite of genetic is not choice. The opposite of choice is not genetic. In fact, our choices are heavily influenced by our genes and how those genes respond to environmental inputs. That is, for what it's worth, it doesn't really seem like people get to choose their sexual attraction. And if they could, if that was a choice we could actually make, I suspect many people would probably choose to be attracted to men and women, because this gives you the greatest number of possible mates in the world and the greatest number of people you can engage in proximately pleasurable intercourse with. Why would you want to arbitrarily restrict yourself to half the population in terms of where you get to find pleasurable sexual experiences? That seems like a choice a lot of people wouldn't make if they could make it. Yet I don't think that I can find members of my own sex attractive in much the same way I don't think a gay man can choose to suddenly find women sexually attractive. I don't believe there's any choice component here. However, despite the distinction between genetic and choice being a bad distinction, we don't want to make that. This does bring us to two additional hypotheses that have been put forth for explaining homosexual orientations. The first of these is simple: genetic mutation. That is, a random mutation can occur during development, and many mutations, because they are random, tend to produce non-adaptive or maladaptive outcomes. Random changes tend to make reproductive outcomes worse, not better. So perhaps homosexuality is just maintained in the population due to some random genetic mutations. Seems reasonable to ask the question. But this explanation isn't particularly viable, because genetic mutations are rare. Indeed, mutations need to be rare, because they're usually deleterious. If random mutations were very common, complex life would be unable to exist. All our adaptations would be constantly destroyed by random mutations. And since the fitness costs to having homosexual orientations are very large, if it was caused just by a simple genetic mutation each generation, the preferences, the orientations, could only be as common as the mutation rate, as the rate of new mutations entered the population, because they get selected out each and every generation. And because homosexuality makes up about 1 to 5% of the population, It's simply too common to be caused by mutation. Some estimates I've seen, if you have things that are caused by genetic mutations, you see them about 1 in 10,000 people or less. So if you're talking about 1 in 10,000 compared to 1 to 5 per 100, it's clear there's a discrepancy here. However, there's also another explanation based on genetics, which is a bit more directed. And this one proposes an explanation invoking what they call sexually antagonistic selection. Sexually antagonistic selection refers to a case where a gene is adaptive when it's inherited by one sex, but maladaptive when it's inherited by the other. That is, this gene might be good if it ends up in a boy, but it's bad if it ends up in a girl. And this could balance it out because the downsides you see in one sex can be balanced out by the benefits in the other. So in the case of homosexuality, it was proposed by a researcher, Andrea Ciani, that perhaps the genes that affect development in women that make them more likely to produce additional offspring are adaptive, but when some of those same genes are inherited by a male offspring, it increases the odds of developing a homosexual orientation. So in essence here, the reproductive fitness costs of homosexuality in males are balanced out by the reproductive benefits in females. But whichever explanation we're talking about, whether it's mutation or whether it's sexually antagonistic selection, both of these require a strong genetic component to sexual orientation. So let's see what the data says about that. What we can do to examine genetic influences is to look at what are called concordance rates for homosexuality. Now, to understand what we're about to do, I'm going to take a quick detour into some peculiarities of human reproduction. So usually, in humans, women will release one egg per reproductive cycle, one viable egg per reproductive cycle, rather. And if that one egg is fertilized and carries to term, it produces one child. But sometimes this doesn't happen, and a woman will give birth to twins, which is two offspring resulting from the same reproductive cycle. Now, there are two types of these twins, monozygotic and dizygotic. In this case, a zygote, that just means an egg that's been fertilized by a sperm. So since mono means one, monozygotic twins means two offspring are born from the same fertilized egg. This happens when post-fertilization, the developing zygote divides in some unusual fashion, which then causes it to form into two separate bodies instead of one. So in other words here, you have a single fertilized egg that splits into two people, two genetically identical twins. Accordingly, the monozygotic twins are also referred to as identical twins because they share 100% of their genes in common with each other. They're from the same fertilized egg. By contrast, dizygotic twins refers to a case where a female has released two separate viable eggs during a reproductive cycle, and these two different eggs have been fertilized by two different sperm. So while these two children that develop at the same time share a maternal gestational environment, they're no more similar to each other genetically than brothers or sisters usually are. In fact, it's technically possible for dizygotic twins to be born to two separate fathers, assuming, of course, that there's sperm from multiple males present in a woman's reproductive tract at the same time. But for now, we're just going to ignore that possibility and assume that these dizygotic twins have the same father. So you have these identical twins, and you have the non-identical twins. You also call them fraternal twins. I think we can use identical and non-identical just to keep this as clear as possible. So you have the identical twins that share 100% of their genes in common, and you have the non-identical twins that share 50% of their genes in common, like regular brothers and sisters. So as you might expect, identical twins show a remarkable similarity to each other in a great many ways, both physical and psychological, owing to their completely shared genome. Fraternal twins, the non-identical ones, are also similar because they do share 50% of their genes, but usually less similar than identical twins. Brothers and sisters are similar to each other because they share genes in common. Identical twins are more similar to each other because they share all their genes in common. So while identical twins are always going to be the same sex, for instance, owing to how sex is determined in humans, non-identical twins are no more likely to share a sex than brothers or sisters usually do. So if you're asking about a concordance rate, this is a question about how similar offspring are to each other. Specifically, given that one twin shows a certain trait, what are the chances the other twin shows that same trait? We saw an example of sex just now. In identical twins, if one twin is male, the other twin will be male approximately 100% of the time. Whereas if you have non-identical twins, it's a 50% probability as to whether they'll share a sex or not. Eye color appears to work kind of similarly. Monozygotic, these identical twins, tend to be far more likely to share something like eye color than non-identical twins. And while it's not to say that environmental factors aren't important for determining something like sex or eye color, environmental factors always do matter, it does show that in the environments that these twins are raised in, there is often not enough meaningful environmental differences to result in substantially different developmental paths. So even though environment matters for eye color, how environment matters, what matters, and when it matters doesn't seem to result in identical twins ending up with different eye colors very often. Whereas non-identical twins may end up with different eye colors regularly, largely because of different genes. So we can ask this same question of sexual orientation of the twins. That is, if you have one twin that is homosexual, what are the chances their other twin is? Does it matter if the twins are genetically identical, or does it matter if they're not genetically identical? If identical twins are more common, this implies that shared genes are responsible in some capacity for these similar developmental pathways. If genetically identical twins are no more similar than non-identical twins, then this implies the genes might not be having that strong of an effect on the developmental pathway. So I do want to caution at this point that similarities in traits doesn't necessarily mean you're looking at genes for that trait, as much as what you're seeing are genes associated with the development of that trait. And for example, if you find identical twins resemble each other in height more similarly than non-identical twins do, this might mean that there are genes in people for making them taller, in the broadest sense of the word. But you might also say there are similar genes that perhaps contribute to digestive functioning, and better digestive functioning means you're extracting more resources, and more resources means you can grow taller. Or perhaps in immune functioning, because genetically identical twins have similar immune systems, maybe they're fighting off pathogens more similarly, and this is resulting in them having similar heights. So bear this in mind, that when you're talking about these concordance rates, these genetic influences, you're not necessarily talking about a gene for the trait, but merely genes associated with the traits. They could have direct or indirect influences. So with this general overview of concordance rates and their importance in mind, there's one paper I wanted to look at here by Bailey and colleagues in 2000 that attempted to systematically recruit twins from an Australian twin registry and asked them about their sexual behaviors and preferences. And they took this very systematic approach both to maximize their sample size, because twins are rare in the population, and homosexual orientations are rare in the population. So you want to get as many of people as you can who are twins. And they also want to minimize their response bias. That is, response bias refers to, depending on how you recruit your sample for your study, you might end up more or less likely to find a particular result. So that is, if I went to do some research on athletic performance and I pulled my sample from people at the gym, I might get different results than if I recruited people from Walmart, because people at the gym are more likely to be engaging in certain behaviors. So what they're doing here is they're trying to capture the broadest possible sample of twins they can in a random fashion and avoid any type of response bias. Now, they also had to define sexual orientation. And this is something of a difficult task because people vary. It's not necessarily just you're this or you're that in your sexual orientation. And so what they did in this case is they grouped people as either heterosexual or non-heterosexual. So not necessarily homosexual, but are you almost exclusively heterosexual or are you not? Again, because it's difficult to find twins, it's difficult to find homosexual orientations, and when you have two rare groups, you got to do what you can to maximize your sample size. So what they did is they gave people the Kinsey scale. It's a 0 to 6 scale that says 0 being completely heterosexual, 6 being completely homosexual. Where do you put yourself on this scale? And if you answered a 0, they would bin you as heterosexual. And if you answered, say, a 2 through a 6, they would bin you as non-heterosexual. And this is how they were defining this. So here's the meat of the result. In terms of the concordance rate, if one identical twin, genetically identical twin, reported that they were non-heterosexual, their other genetically identical co-twin said they were also non-heterosexual between 20 to 40% of the time, depending on the sex of the respondent and how you classified heterosexual or non-heterosexual. So to reiterate, to be very clear, twins that share 100% of their genes are only overlapping in their later sexual orientation about 20 to 40% of the time. Now remember, that doesn't mean 20 to 40% of twins were homosexual. That's not what that means. That means that if one twin said, I am not heterosexual, 20 to 40% of the time the other twin would say that. For non-identical twins, that is those who are basically brothers and sisters, but they were born at the same time and share 50% of their genes, this concordance rate on non-heterosexual orientations ranged from 0 to 30%. On average, it was close to about 10. So while identical twins were indeed more alike than fraternal twins, this implies there is an important genetic component. There's still a great deal of variation in sexual orientation not attributable to any kind of simple genetic influences. And in reviewing other studies on this topic that were using different populations, different sampling techniques, another paper by DeWood and Bailey was reporting on this concordance rate as well. For identical twins across a number of different studies, it ranged between 20 and 50%. And the non-identical twins, this concordance rate was between 10 and 20%. So regardless of what study we're looking at, it's clear that the picture isn't as simple as sexual orientation being 100% determined by genes. In fact, it doesn't even seem mostly attributable to shared genes. It appears mostly attributable to other factors. Now again, I want to be very clear here. This does not mean that people are choosing their sexual orientation. It just means that the causes of homosexuality are not as simple as a gene for that orientation. So just so we're very clear about this, again, the opposite of genetic is not choice. But from these results, we can see that explanations for homosexuality of either genetic mutation or sexually antagonistic selection, these don't work particularly well to explain the phenomenon we're looking at. At the very best, these explanations are incomplete. After all, if the sexually antagonistic explanation was accurate, that really wouldn't help explain at all, for the record, why women develop homosexual orientations, because that model was dealing exclusively with men. And this would also leave us with this mystery of why genetically identical twins are developing different orientations. That is, if the same sexually antagonistic genes don't necessarily cause homosexual orientations, why are they causing them at all? And if genetics aren't the whole picture, or even the majority of the picture, what are the other causes out there in the environment? And further, why does it seem that exclusive same-sex sexual orientations are so rarely documented in non-human species? As we mentioned before, it's largely found in humans and sheep that we know of right now. If sexually antagonistic selection explains it, why doesn't this happen in more species that we've documented? Why is it so restricted to these few? Again, to clarify, that's not to say homosexual behaviors haven't been known in other species. They have been, plenty of times. But rather that these lifelong, exclusive homosexual preferences don't tend to be that commonly documented. That is, most other animals that occasionally engage in homosexual behavior also engage in lots of heterosexual behavior. We're looking for exclusive, lifelong homosexuality. So if these same genes don't necessarily need to result in homosexual orientations in humans, and they're also rarely documented in other species, what's going on? Are humans just really bad at documenting this behavior pretty much in every species? Are lots of other species showing homosexual behavior, but we just haven't been documenting it well? That doesn't seem likely. We found it in humans, we found it in rams. You'd think we'd be able to find it in others. Maybe people haven't been looking too hard, but that doesn't strike me as the correct explanation. We might also be wondering, well, have humans been unable to solve some adaptive problems related to sexually antagonistic selection that other species did solve? That also seems rather strange. We're going to have to look outside of the genes for what's causing the development. However, before we start looking outside the genes, there are two more ideas that have been proposed I'd like to examine. The first of these is kin selection. As you might remember from our previous lectures, kin selection refers to adaptations that arise because they deliver benefits to other bodies that contain copies of shared genes. In short, basically adaptations that benefit family members at an expense to you. The example we've reviewed before were mammary glands, where mothers endure a physiological cost to deliver a benefit to their offspring. And they do so because they are related to their offspring, which allows them to suffer this cost. So long as the benefits they're delivering outweigh the cost when you adjust for the degree of genetic relatedness, you can find kin selection mechanisms. So it's been proposed by several researchers, starting with E.O. Wilson in 1975, I believe, that homosexuality might represent a kin selection mechanism. As the logic goes, even if someone with a homosexual orientation might not be personally reproducing, maybe they're investing heavily in their kin, not unlike non-reproductive bees and ants do, these type of colony insects, where most of the bees and ants do not reproduce, but they invest very heavily in the queens that do. So is that what homosexuality is? Well, we can do away with this hypothesis pretty quickly because it doesn't even really work on a theoretical level. The reason it doesn't work is several-fold. First, the amount of investment you would need to see for this explanation to work would be so massive, it would basically put motherly love to shame. To be more precise, a homosexual relative would need to invest so much in their brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews that they would make their close family members produce several additional living children they otherwise would not produce. And just think about how much you would have to invest in a sister, say, to ensure that she had several extra children she would not have herself produced. That level of investment would be very hard to miss. You would have to see people with homosexual orientations basically invested in their family around the clock. And the second reason this doesn't work on a theoretical level is very simple. Homosexuality does not appear to be very well functionally organized to enhance investment. That is, if you're talking about bees and ants, you don't usually see a lot of homosexuality. You see asexuality. They forego mating effort to invest in family members. What they don't do is spend a lot of time and energy pursuing non-reproductive mating opportunities. That would be wasteful and distract from kin selection mechanisms. And of course, the third reason that this theory doesn't work out is empirical. Some research that you can see here by Bowbrow and Bailey in 2001 found no evidence that homosexual individuals invested more in family members relative to their heterosexual counterparts. Kin selection simply doesn't work here, not theoretically and not empirically. There have also been some proposals from researchers like Barry Cooley and Diana Fleshman that looked at homosexual behaviors, not necessarily orientations, but behaviors. And they propose that you can use those to build social bonds. That is, if you want someone to like you and cooperate with you and be your friend, what better way to do that than to deliver them the proximately pleasurable experiences of sexual touch, orgasm, and other erotic behaviors? You would probably like people who provided you with orgasms more than you like people who didn't. So this adaptive hypothesis, in other words, proposes a social bonding explanation for some homosexual behaviors, like a social glue. I'm not going to spend too much time on these theories for a few simple reasons. First, they don't explain homosexual orientations even in theory. They might predict bisexuality, but they wouldn't predict homosexuality. Further, most social relationships appear to be navigated just fine without any sexual contact, homosexual or heterosexual. So one is left wondering what the sex is really adding to the bonding here. Indeed, if humans used sexual behaviors of any kind, heterosexual or homosexual, to cement social relationships, we would probably expect a lot more sexual behaviors in that regard. They'd be like hugs or handshakes. You could have a business meeting where people end the meeting by groping each other sexually because that feels good and then they'd feel closer to each other, but we don't really see that. And further, since building social bonds and selecting mates are two different adaptive problems, the social bonding theories would also predict that sexual behavior should look quite differently across these contexts. Specifically, the things that make someone an attractive social ally are not necessarily the same things that make them an attractive sexual partner. And so we might expect that sexual attractions and behaviors would vary substantially in these contexts. As we don't have any reason to suspect that homosexual attractions are predominantly driven by different inputs than heterosexual attractions, as well as the fact that these homosexual attractions are relatively infrequent, I have my doubts that this bonding explanation carries much weight to begin with. And finally, the social bonding hypotheses don't really explain the childhood gender nonconformity that we saw. After all, it's not just gender nonconforming children that need to make friends. Gender conforming children need to make friends too. And so we should expect this type of homosexual behavior to occur across the board. And it doesn't happen. So these theories don't really get us very far. So this brings us to two hypotheses remaining of environmental influences on the development of sexual orientation. Now, as we discussed before, all traits, physical and psychological, need to develop. You have to go from this single fertilized egg to a complete organism. And while people generally follow a similar developmental pathway, that's why we all tend to have 2 eyes and 2 arms and 1 heart, and all our biological systems tend to perform similar functions and perform in similar ways. Sometimes the developmental course can be changed by environmental factors. And by locating these environmental factors, pinpointing when they act during development, how they act during development, and why they act during development, you can really understand the outcomes that occur and the deviations that occur from these developmental pathways in a far better fashion. So what things could be changing development then? The first of these hypotheses for homosexuality is known as the maternal immunity hypothesis, or the maternal immune hypothesis. And it was proposed by a researcher called Ray Blanchard in the 1990s. His idea here was inspired by the finding that homosexual men specifically tend to have more older brothers. In fact, each additional older male brother appears to increase the chance of the next male offspring developing homosexual orientation by about 33%. And that doesn't mean that 33% of second-born boys are homosexual. It means more that if 2% of first-born males are homosexual, then 2.66% of second-born males tend to be. And then 3.5% of third-born males, and so on down the line. Older sisters seem to have no effect. There doesn't seem to be an effect of the age of the mother or the father. It seems to be very specific. It's male-specific. You don't see this in women. Women, there's no connection between their homosexual orientation and the number of siblings that they have that are older, male or female. It's only in men that you see this. But the more older brothers a man has, the greater the probability that man ends up homosexual later in life. So something seems to be going on here with their development related to the number of older brothers that men have. And what could that be? Well, what Blanchard proposed is that there's a maternal immune response against male-specific Y-linked antigens. I'm not going to get very deep into the biology here, but I'll give you the general point that you want to bear in mind, which is that when a male fetus is developing, the male fetus's cells have some male-specific proteins that they express. And when these male-specific proteins cross into the female body during pregnancy, her immune system will sometimes treat these as foreign invaders, as if they were bacteria or viruses. And her immune system can mount an attack against those male-specific proteins. So the maternal antibodies that start getting produced can occasionally then cross back into the developing fetus and affect the development of that body, because the maternal immune system can effectively be attacking the developing fetus, treating it as if it's a foreign invader. In some extreme cases, this can cause miscarriage, but it can also affect development in other ways. So the general idea then is that a mother's body may attack male offspring owing to the male-specific proteins they're expressing as part of some type of overactive immune response. And so as mothers are exposed to more and more male pregnancies, their immune system begins to get better at recognizing and attacking these male-specific proteins, thus affecting their development. So if the maternal immune system here is affecting the development of the fetal male brain, that may alter the course of typical development and later result in a homosexual orientation. And this is what would account for the birth order effect in males. And there is evidence consistent with this idea. Specifically, men who have more older brothers, whether that man is gay or straight, men that have more older brothers tend to weigh less at birth than men with fewer older brothers. And homosexual men in particular tend to have lower birth weights, than heterosexual men. And this suggests there's some kind of developmental perturbation going on here. When you're talking about first children, it doesn't appear that homosexual men or heterosexual men rather, have different birth weights. It doesn't appear to account for firstborn children. And so maybe this suggests some type of dose-dependent role for the maternal immune response. And further, if you look at non-human mammals, male fetuses do indeed provoke immune responses by mothers, and the mother's immune responses can indeed affect the development of these fetuses in a variety of ways. So there does seem to be a maternal immune response going on. Now, this hypothesis would be consistent with the other evidence that we've reviewed so far in some regards, such as the early gender nonconformity in children. Because if this maternal immune response is happening early in life, that could, in principle, explain why children are behaving gender atypically, in some cases, the males anyway. And it could also be consistent with the data on identical twins, to the extent that if you have genetically identical twins, they might be more likely to be affected by the mother's immune system similar ways during development, at least relative to non-identical ones. But there are several reservations I have about this theory. The first and most obvious is that it does nothing to explain female homosexuality. To the extent the maternal immune hypothesis is correct, it's certainly an incomplete picture of how sexual orientations are developing, because it's not accounting for half of the population in this regard. Second, this theory also seems rather strange in light of the non-human data we've discussed. As a reminder, homosexual behavior has been documented in many species, but documentation of homosexual orientations via consistent lifelong patterns of behavior are much more seldom documented in the literature. We've documented them in humans, we've documented it in rams, and basically no other species. So to the extent that a maternal immune response is the cause of male homosexuality, it would seem rather odd that this doesn't occur in many, many, many more species. That is, it would seem strange that many other species appear to solve this adaptive problem, but for some reason humans and sheep don't. Because the reproductive fitness costs to this orientation are so high, it's really strange that it seems to crop up in a small number of species and not most of them. At least most mammals, where a maternal immune response, in theory, should be present in pretty much every mammalian species. And third, this hypothesis doesn't actually show us any direct cause and effect. That yes, there is this correlation between birth order and later sexual orientation in men. And yes, there does seem to be something to this idea of a maternal immune response against male fetuses during development. But this doesn't demonstrate that it's the maternal immune response directly causing the orientation to develop. It's possible, but it's not demonstrated. In other words, what we have here is another correlation, not necessarily a causation. So while it could be the case that maternal immune systems are treating male fetuses as foreign invaders and mounting immune responses against them, that response may not actually be the cause of the later sexual orientation, but merely open the possibility for it to exist at a higher rate. Let's think about it this way. If you're sick, you usually have low energy because your body is spending a lot of resources to try and fight off an infection. And it's using less energy for other things. When you're sick, you're tired, you don't want to move. Now, if you're sick and you got into a physical fight at the same time with somebody, you're probably more likely to lose that fight and get beaten up. However, that doesn't mean the infection caused you to get beaten up. The infection didn't cause your physical injuries from the fight. The infection just made it more likely that you were going to lose that fight and suffer the consequences. So there's no cause and effect demonstrated in this hypothesis yet. It could be a spurious correlation like the one we see here between the sale of ice cream and forest fires. Yes, they correlate with each other pretty well, but it's not that people are buying ice cream as causing forest fires or vice versa. It's that people are buying ice cream during the summer when it's warm, heat is drying out the forests, and that heat is causing the forest fires to become more likely too. Maternal immune response could be similar to that. It's opening the door for whatever is causing the homosexual orientation to develop, but is not necessarily itself causing it. So this is going to bring us to our final hypothesis that we're going to cover today. But before we get to that hypothesis, I want to take a small detour just to set the stage for what it proposes and understanding the general logic behind it. Many people would agree that the ability to hear is adaptive. Hearing helps guide behaviors and solve lots of adaptive problems, such as locating food, locating water, avoiding predators, avoiding naturally occurring dangers, and many other things. Solving these problems successfully can massively increase an organism's chance of successfully reproducing. If you can hear, you're better at reproducing because you're better at solving a lot of adaptive tasks that keep you alive. Accordingly, because hearing is adaptive, most members of the species develop both external mechanisms for hearing, like your ears, and psychological mechanisms for translating what your ears take in into useful inputs that guide your behavior. So hearing is adaptive. We can all agree on that. So imagine you, as a researcher, came to this population of people, and you found that an appreciable minority of a species is consistently being born deaf every generation. Let's just say 5%, so we have a number. 5% of a species is consistently born deaf. That would probably strike you as strange. Because if hearing is helping this organism solve adaptive problems, and we have all these psychological and physical adaptations for solving problems of hearing, why are so many of them failing to work as they typically do? Why are so many of these organisms being born deaf? So let's run back through all these previous hypotheses we've covered for homosexuality and see how we might apply them to this scenario of deafness. You might propose, as Darrell Bem did, that being able to hear and not being able to hear are both normal outcomes of the same developmental mechanism. And some organisms just end up deaf because sounds weren't viewed as exotic enough during development. This, of course, makes no sense, and exotic becomes erotic fails to explain deafness entirely here. You might propose a genetic explanation, where a random mutation causes deafness. But that's too common in the population. Random mutations, that's about 1 in 10,000. Here we're talking about 5 per 100, 1 in 20. Far too common for random mutation. You might propose a sexually antagonistic hypothesis, where maybe females end up more fertile if male offspring are more likely to end up deaf. But that really wouldn't explain why women go deaf, and that wouldn't explain why identical twins aren't always born deaf. But you could propose that hypothesis, it just doesn't fit. You might propose that deaf people are more likely to help their families, a kin selection mechanism. But how deafness helps them achieve this goal doesn't really seem straightforward at all, does it? Indeed, being able to hear probably helps you solve tasks and invest in family better. You might propose that deafness encourages social bonding, but it's hard to see why that's the case, because plenty of animals which can hear bond just fine. You might also propose that deafness results from an immune response against developing fetuses, but this doesn't explain why lots of other species aren't born deaf, and it still doesn't explain why women are born deaf. None of what we've covered so far really seems to fit. However, we do know of something in the world that causes quite a bit of deafness. According to the CDC, Center for Disease Control here in the US, as it turns out, if a woman is pregnant and becomes infected by rubella, the rubella virus, especially during the first trimester of her pregnancy, the chances that her offspring are going to be born deaf skyrocket. Some data I found from a study by Wild et al. In 1989 found about 60% of 111 children born with a rubella infection showed later hearing impairments in life. Now, interestingly, rubella infections don't cause deafness in adults. When you get a rubella infection as an adult, you might get a mild fever, a headache, some nasal congestion, you're itchy, you have a rash, you have some aching joints, but you don't become deaf. However, when you're talking about a developing fetus, this infection can have massive developmental impacts because the developing fetal body is not yet prepared to handle this infection the way an adult is. And its development hasn't yet been set, and so is more likely to be shifted by the infection. And we saw an example of something like this similar when it came to pregnancy sickness. Mothers tend to avoid certain foods when they're pregnant, especially during the first trimester, because while those foods are perfectly safe for the mother, some of the compounds in them are actually toxic for the developing fetus and can harm or even kill it if they're ingested in large quantities. Things that adult bodies can handle and overcome are not necessarily as easily overcome in fetal bodies. So, if you've been following the example so far, you should have a pretty good sense for what Cochran, Ewald, and Cochran proposed in a 2000 paper entitled Infectious Causation of Disease in Evolutionary Perspective. This is a fascinating paper, outlines a great deal about infectious diseases, how difficult it can be to understand them, and the practical reasons why, and what the consequences of infectious disease are. And in this paper, the authors propose that it's possible infectious agents are a causal culprit of later homosexual orientations. Specifically, what they propose is that some pathogen, likely acting early in development, can have some organizational impacts on the later development of the fetus, which result in a lot of different things, but in this case may also result in a homosexual orientation later in life. Now, there is a very theoretical plausibility to this hypothesis, owing to the reproductive costs of homosexual orientations. When a trait negatively impacts your reproductive fitness, but is present in a substantial number in a population over time, it's often the case that an infectious agent is the culprit. And that explains why the traits haven't been selected out of the population. We covered one example of rubella and deafness, but there are others. One great example that I bring up is sickle cell anemia. Now, this is a genetic disease that involves the development of abnormal red blood cells. The way this works is it's a recessive gene, so you need a copy from both your mother and your father. If you get a copy from both, you end up with sickle cell disease. If you get just one, you end up with what's called sickle cell trait, and if you get none, your red blood cells tend to be typical, like most other people's are. So if you get two copies of this recessive gene, one from each parent, this results in red blood cells that die far earlier than normal. And then there are also things associated with this, called like pain, swelling, more frequent infections, strokes, organ damage from uninterrupted blood flow, low oxygen levels, and a variety of other symptoms that can frequently prove to be life-threatening. Now, despite the costs of this genetic disorder, despite the costs of sickle cell anemia, it actually remains relatively frequent in some populations over time. Now, it's maintained in those populations not because of the costs of anemia. Those costs are massive and tend to get selected out, but rather because genetic carriers, those that have one recessive gene and one dominant gene that doesn't contribute to anemia, they don't develop the sickle cell anemia. But what they do get is additional resistance to malaria. That is, if you carry the gene for sickle cell, you're more resistant for malaria. If you have two copies, you end up with anemia and you're not more resistant. But if you get one copy, you end up more resistant to malarial infections. For those of you who don't know, malaria is this blood-borne infection, usually spread by mosquito bites. And those who have this sickle cell trait tend to be far less affected by it, because the malaria is not as good as affecting their blood cells. So for this reason, you tend to see sickle cell almost exclusively in populations that live in areas with a high risk of malaria and pretty much nowhere else. This is because the damage to reproductive fitness caused by sickle cell is balanced against the damage caused by malaria infections. And make no mistake about it, malaria is quite the killer in many locations of the world. In about 2019, the numbers I was able to dig up said malaria resulted in roughly 500,000 deaths worldwide in 2019, 1 year. So while it's not good for one's reproductive fitness to carry this sickle cell trait, the costs to carrying it are lower than the costs imposed by malaria. And so in areas where there's a lot of malarial infections, you tend to see this sickle cell trait because it's better to have that than it is to get infected by malaria and potentially die. So as in this paper, as a general rule, the authors propose to look for infectious causation when there is a trait that carries a high degree of reproductive fitness costs and is maintained at a relatively common level in the population. And they provide several examples throughout the paper, including infectious agents being implicated as the cause for ulcers, cancers, infertility, OCD, and schizophrenia. So to be clear up front, there is no direct evidence in favor of this hypothesis. Specifically, there's no infection, no combination of infections, or no combination of infections and other environmental factors that have yet been implicated in the development of a homosexual orientation. There is no evidence directly supporting this yet. And finding such evidence may prove difficult, owing to the very cryptic nature of infections and their effects. That is, you don't usually see sexual orientation develop until much later in life, say, early teens. Which means there's this very large window during which an infectious agent might act and affect development. And similarly, as we saw at the rubella example, the same infection that's acquired at different points in life can have different impacts on development, which makes cause and effect very difficult to uncover. It might be hard to determine that rubella causes deafness if a lot of adults catch rubella and none of them go deaf. But if it's caught during the first trimester of pregnancy, then it can have much different impacts. And further, I don't think any researchers have really been actively examining this possibility on any large scale. So we don't have any evidence in favor of this hypothesis at the present time. However, the hypothesis is at least consistent with the other known evidence that we've reviewed so far. It can account for the childhood gender nonconformity, because infections can act early in development and shift it away from its typical course. It can account for the twin data, as identical twins are more likely to be affected similarly by similar infections, but twins don't always contract them at the same time or to the same degree. Indeed, you actually do see high identical twin concordance rates for other infections like leprosy and tuberculosis, suggesting that what's inherited here are some genetic predispositions, perhaps for immune system functioning or certain biological factors that make the infections more or less likely to attack somebody. This theory could also account for homosexuality in both males and females. So it's also consistent with our birth order effects, given that if a male fetus is being perhaps attacked by a maternal immune system, this could weaken the fetal development and make it more vulnerable to other types of developmental issues, something perhaps to look into. And it can account for the non-human data as well, potentially explaining why humans and sheep, two species that have a relatively long history of co-residence with one another, may show similar impacts, as infections have been known to occasionally jump between species. And it can account for why reproductively maladaptive strategies can persist in populations over time in very high numbers, because there's always this evolutionary arms race between infectious causation, infectious diseases, and the hosts that they live on. Now, I want to make this very clear. what the final hypothesis we just reviewed suggests, because I know people in this area may occasionally misunderstand what they heard, whether intentionally or unintentionally. As we've discussed, there's a lot of motivated reasoning here, and I want to nip some of that in the bud right now. This infectious hypothesis does not suggest that homosexuality is a disease, and it does not suggest you can catch it. Just like rubella doesn't cause deafness in adults, the same infection at different points in development can have much different effects on people. You can't catch being deaf in much the same way you cannot catch a homosexual orientation. I want to make sure that's very clear. Something being caused by infection does not mean it's contagious. HPV, for instance, is known to cause cancer, for instance, but you can't catch cancer because cancer is not contagious. Second, the hypothesis does not suggest that homosexual people are in some way sick. It merely states that the development may be affected by an early infection that could have been acquired decades in the past. Again, think back to the rubella example. Deaf people are not sick if they're deaf because of rubella. They just end up deaf later in life because of an infection acquired early in development that may have long ago passed. And as such, this does not imply you can in any way change sexual orientation in the present by treating an infection. And third, I want to make it clear that this hypothesis doesn't itself carry any moral implications. As I've said before, my approval of homosexuality, personally and socially, is not based on what caused it, but rather based on that orientation not causing harm to other people and acceptance of it bringing more happiness into the world. For much the same reason, I wouldn't think a deaf person morally bad or their deafness somehow a character flaw because of what caused it. The cause of a trait is separate than our matter of acceptance of it. Nevertheless, many people do not accept the homosexual orientation on a moral level, though acceptance has been growing. According to some Gallup data I was able to pull, acceptance of homosexual marriage, at least in the US, has been growing from 27% in 1996 to 71% in 2023. Very, very promising progress. So perhaps you find homosexuality more morally acceptable, perhaps you don't. Perhaps you may have found one of these hypotheses I've discussed today morally acceptable. Perhaps you find the people that have these moral objections really weird. And so next time what we're going to do is start to examine the moral reactions people have, not just to homosexuality, but also to sex in general, to topics like birth control, and other related things that surround these moral discussions. And from there, we can use this as our example to jump off and examine the evolution of our moral psychology more generally, and start thinking about what the biological functions of those are.